Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for another edition of Arkansans Ask. For the next 60 minutes, our guest, live, the Honorable Asa Hutchinson, Governor of Arkansas. Governor, thanks very much for making this time.
It's always good to be with you, Steve, and on AE10.
Well, this is the People's Program, so we are going to get in as many of your questions tonight as we can. It's a toll-free call. Operators standing by, 1-800-662-2386. Email questions are equally acceptable and eagerly sought. paffairs@aetn.org. And you can tweet or Twitter or whatever you call it at AETN, hashtag ARAsk. And we'll repeat that several times during the broadcast. Again, Governor, thanks for joining us. We had sine die, a couple of 3 weeks ago now, the General Assembly. It was a session in which you hit home runs. You got everything you asked for.
We had a very good session. You know, in terms of history, which I like to look at history, I think it was one of the most successful sessions that accomplished big items. And it wasn't one big item, but it was multiple big items that we tackled. And the legislature responded very well, not just with my priorities, which was lowering or raising teacher pay over the next 4 years by $4,000. Of course, having a good highway funding bill, tax cuts, which we did, and transforming state government. But they had their priorities as well, which fit in to what we need to do in growing our state. So I was very pleased with the session. I think it was historic in terms of what we were able to accomplish and puts the state on a good path.
In terms of the tax program, sir, and the general revenue budget that was approved, there are some, we have a robust economy, nobody disputes that. In fact, the Dow and the S&P today up, but it's been a zigzag affair, and there have been occasional signals of a slowdown, I won't call it a weakening, retail sales, industrial production. Are you fearful, as some in your own caucus were, your own conference, your own party in the General Assembly, of an imminent slowdown, or by the end of the year, fourth quarter slowdown?
I'm not fearful of it, but I recognize we've had a very long period of sustained economic growth, and you wonder how long that will continue. And obviously with the tariff disputes that are ongoing that impact our farmers, you worry about farm income and how that impacts our state budget as well. And so sure, there's things that you keep an eye on, and that's one of the reasons that not only do we budget carefully, our state budget, but we also set aside savings. And so we have a long-term reserve fund that we continue to build up to help us through any economic downturn, to make sure we can manage our state budget carefully. We've never had that in previous years, and I'm talking about before I became governor. It was created during my administration, and we have over $126 million in there, and every month, just like a family tries to do, we put some money aside in savings, just as some families do.
Was there, one criticism, sir, was that there was an absence of what would call strategic investment, even with the $4,000 teacher pay raise. The state, higher ed was flat, for example.
Well, I would disagree with that completely. If you look at our surrounding states, higher ed has been cut by many states. We have true maintained level funding for it, but then we had the last cycle with our productivity funding model, a $10 billion bump up for higher ed investments. And you've got to remember that we have part of our sales tax going into the educational trust funds that benefit K through 12 and higher education, and that is robust and grows. So I think we have invested. You know, there's always many needs there. We actually froze tuition at my request, but the higher education responded to that 2 years ago, trying to hold our costs down for the students. You look at other strategic investments that we're making, my goodness, we just invest in highways. That is a long-term investment that we've made. That's $96 million that will be coming in this fall, and it'll be a $300 million program, the largest in the history of our state. And then, of course, today I announced the state broadband plan to put high-speed broadband in every community in Arkansas, 500 residents or more, within the next 4 years. Now, that's not a state dollar investment, but it's a state leadership item, and that's going to be invested from Washington grant dollars that we're enhancing because we have a good plan. So, no, I think we have invested in the future, from education on to highways and other infrastructure.
Some of the highway fund is about a third of it, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, about a third of the, you made reference to about 96 million, close to, call it 100 million, will be coming out of general revenue. Any reluctance to tap into general revenue?
Well, I did have some reluctance to tap into general revenue. Of course, we did it about 3 years ago with a short-term highway plan that puts $50 million every year into highways, but I resisted putting more money into highways. But the legislature was very clear that if we're going to raise the gas tax even 3 cents, we want to make sure we can tell the voters we're doing everything to constrain the growth of government, save money, be efficient, and that we're devoting what we can of general revenues. And so with that message, we took casino revenue money that would be going into general revenue and allocated that to our highways, which is $35 million every year. And so we're combining $35 million plus the 50, so it's $85 million every year that will be going from general revenue into highways, and that's quite a commitment. That's one of the reasons that our transformation of state government is important, to make it as efficient as possible. But I think it's a very good balance that we have with a very robust $300 million plan that's minimal burden on the taxpayers, but it does make sure that we manage state government well to help make our contribution to highways.
You'll be campaigning for that sales tax extension.
I will. It's going to be on the ballot in November of 2020, and so there'll be an organized effort to make sure that we can extend that half-cent sales tax, and I'll be engaged in that. And I think there's a very big selling point that the Arkansas voters will respond to, that first of all, it is an extension of a half-cent sales tax, so it's not laying something on top of it. But secondly, it allows us to go from a bonding highway program to a pay-as-you-go highway funding system. And I think that's prudent management, because with the bonding program, about 25% of the cost does not go to lay asphalt, but it goes to interest, and it goes to lawyers' fees, bonding fees. And so this will allow us to put more cash toward highways and in a pay-as-you-go system that I think is a good, wise step for our future.
Let me go to transformation in just a moment, sir, but first back on higher ed. You, in fact, the state's universities did heed your admonition, if you want to call that, and they did freeze tuition, but they turned right around and raised fees. So the bite was still there, and just a few yards from where we're sitting now, the UCA has announced, I think, a 5% increase in tuition costs or fees this for the August term.
That's correct, and whenever you look at higher education, I've called upon them, and they've responded well, to emphasize efficiency and try to hold the costs down. They can't have flat tuition costs every year. They're going to have adjustments to it. I want them to hold that down as much as possible and be very prudent in their management of the schools. And so that's one of the reasons our funding rewards those schools that are making the students progress toward degrees, that they are more efficient in their operations. And so we're measuring that and trying to reward those higher education colleges that are successful. One of the things about higher education is that students have options. They have options in state, they have options out of state. We have some great colleges and universities in Arkansas, but there's competition among them. And so they have to be able to compete and have affordable education to attract the students that they want. And so I'm hoping that little free market aspect of higher education will keep those costs down as well.
Let's go to a question that was phoned in or emailed in, I believe. We mentioned that email questions are acceptable. This one came in a bit before we began the broadcast, which is certainly permissible. Problems continue on the Buffalo River, an ongoing issue, sir. And how do you intend your administration would strike a balance between commerce and protecting natural resources?
Well, it's a great question. It's a very timely question, and there's not a Arkansas treasure that's more important than the Buffalo River in terms of our natural resources. It's something that I enjoy, everybody in Arkansas enjoys, but also those from out of state. And whenever you look at the Buffalo River watershed, we have our Buffalo River Action Plan that our state agencies are looking at ways that we can better protect the buffalo. I'll be meeting and getting a report from them very soon. Obviously, when you look at the C&H hog farm, that does create some controversy that's out there. This was given a permit before I became governor to operate a very large-scale hog farm. We monitor that very carefully to make sure there's not damage done to the river, but it still is a cause of concern. Our Department of Environmental Quality denied their renewal of the permit. It is right now before the appellate body, and it's going to be tied up in court for some time. But we're doing everything that we can, first of all, to make sure the river is healthy, to make sure that we manage that watershed well and have the cooperation of the farmers that are dependent upon their livelihood there as well, but want it to be managed well to protect that river.
Bottom line for the Honorable Asa Hutchinson, do you want that hog farm gone?
Well, we've put a moratorium in place for any additional hog farms. Whenever you look at these farmers, they haven't done anything wrong. It's a hog farm that's not in that most ideal place because it's in the watershed, and we don't want those kind of large-scale operations in that watershed that we're trying to protect. But I think we're going to have to deal this with that one hog farm because they got the permit long before the moratorium and they've tried to manage it well. So we've got to deal with that separately, but we want them to make sure they comply with all the environmental regulations, and that's why before they get the permit renewed, they got to make sure the engineering work is done, that all the safeguards are in place, and that our environmental regulators are satisfied with it.
Is that a yes or a no, sir? I have to ask.
Well, do I want large-scale hog farms in the Buffalo River?
Right.
No, not in that watershed.
All right, thank you, sir. Another question coming in. I think we have, and I want to go to transformation, sir, in a moment. This one came Twitter. Work requirement for Arkansas Works overturned by the courts, or at least stayed. The process for those who were excused or kicked off, to quote the caller, owing to the work requirement. How many have come back, and what is needed for them to come back?
Well, we welcome them back. There was 17,000, I think it was, that lost coverage last year because they didn't comply with the work requirement, which is for able-bodied Medicaid recipients. And so this year, all they have to do to come back on is to sign up. And so we've had over about, the last report I had was about 2,200 that have come back on, which tells you something. Whenever you had 16,000 that lost coverage last year, but only 2,200 got back on this year, that tells me that some of these moved out of state. They might have moved up and got better income, so they no longer qualify. And if you no longer qualify, obviously you're just going to go on with life, or they might have got insurance somewhere else. So I think it tells you that the work requirement actually increased the number of people that had opportunities to work, which is our major objective. And those that comply or need that, we're doing everything we can to make sure they have the availability of that health coverage.
Let me go to transformation, sir, which you brought up just like one of the 4 T's that was a part of your program. Can you tell us where, sir, it is in the evolution or the implementation anyway?
I can. So after the transformation legislation passed, which converts 42 different departments that report to me, which is too large of a cabinet, it constrains it down to 15. And so we set up a transition team that's been hard at work trying to get each of the new 15 cabinet departments ready for the new secretary that will be coming on board. In the meantime, I have been interviewing, making decisions on who those cabinet leaders will be, those cabinet secretaries, and I would expect hopefully next week that I'll start making announcements on those cabinet positions.
My next question, but go ahead.
Well, so that they will then have, 30 to 40 days to organize before those agencies come on board and those departments are created July 1.
What I'm hearing from folks in the bureaucracy is there's a great deal of uncertainty. There always is when there's change. Do you anticipate, looking at the models that your staff has developed and your own concepts of the implementation of transformation, do you anticipate a significant reduction in workforce? There's warm bodies on the state payroll. Over time and through attrition, and that's, we tried to give assurance to our state employees that we're not looking to end their career. We're looking for their help in transforming state government. And sure, over time, there will be efficiencies. There will be someone that might leave state government, and we'll evaluate, does that position need to be filled, or can it be filled by, covered by another agencies that's been brought into the same department. So I have no doubt, and it's been exciting listening to and doing the interviews with potential cabinet secretaries as to the obvious areas that we can have more energy between the agencies within a cabinet department, create some savings there. So very optimistic about it, but change always makes people nervous, but our state employees have embraced it. They understand the importance of it, and while it creates some uncertainty, they've been very supportive. And so you anticipate cabinet appointments or announcements anyway next week? I do. We'll start that process, and we'll see how quickly we do it, but I have 15 to name, and I'm anxious to get them started and pretty close to the end of that process. Probably not all 15, though, next week. We'll wait and see. Okay. All right. Again, a reminder, this is the Audiences program, 1-800-662-2386. Operator standing by. Email questions, paffairs@aetn.org. Tweet your questions at AETN, #ARAsk. You mentioned a moment ago, sir, indeed, earlier today, you unveiled a broadband plan. How's this going to unfold? First of all, Is broadband targeted for rural Arkansas, small town Arkansas? Absolutely. We released that yesterday. Or yesterday, excuse me. Which was the statewide broadband plan for having a high-speed internet connection for every community over 500 residents. But let me backtrack just a little bit. During the first 4 years of my administration, we had a goal which we accomplished, which was to be one of the first states to have high-speed broadband network in every school in Arkansas. So we started with the school children to make sure they had that connectivity, which is important for testing, which is important for research and for computer science. And now they go home, though. Those students go home to their communities, and some might have high-speed broadband at home, others do not in the rural communities. We've got to get that out if we're going to serve our communities, have the quality of life that they need, and to be able to recruit to industry and businesses. And so we set that plan forth today, and it's very specific. It's brought in our private sector partners as a necessary part of it. Obviously, they will actually be carrying it out. But what this plan does, it allows our private sector telecommunications industry, whether it's a rural electric cooperative or a traditional telecom provider, to apply for federal grants so that they can get that investment of the fiber networks for this rural initiative that I have. And so I think without any doubt that they'll be able to get better
proceeds and grant money because of our plan, and then we're going to be able to work with them to make sure that we get this deployed over the next 4 years.
Over the next 4 years. That's the working timeline?
It is. I've set the goal before the end of my administration, 2022, to have this objective met where we have this high-speed broadband in our every community of 500 residents or more. Now, there's communities that I know that are less than that, and they're going to say, well, how about us? Well, if you get that framework, that skeleton out there of fiber that goes to our communities of 500 and less, you're not far away. It's going to be easier for them to reach that, and of course that's the third phase that we need to get to. To give a very specific example though, because the speed we want to have is 25 megabytes, I believe it is, for downloading. That means if we reach this speed that you'll be able to download a song within 1 second. You'll be able to download a 2-hour movie in about 10 minutes. That's a pretty good high speed that allows businesses to do their research, you to go and do your healthcare work and other things that you need in your rural communities.
A number of questions already tonight, sir, involving the economy. We talk about taxes, trade, transportation, the 4 T's. You're now confronted with another one, and that's trade and tariffs, which have every capital in the Western Hemisphere and most in the Eastern kind of tied in knots. And a viewer wants to know specifically about the farm situation. This is not having a very good impact on Arkansas farmers thus far. What can you share with them?
I agree. It's not having a very good impact on Arkansas farmers. You know, we survived last year. You had some additional supplemental payments that came from Washington to make up for the loss in the market value. This year, we're facing the same situation with very low commodity prices, particularly in soybeans. And we're planning, and so the future has some uncertainty in it. I'm pulling for President Trump, that he and President Xi will be able to, of China, will be able to reach an agreement. And the end result needs to be not an agreement that has tariffs that continue to be a burden, but an agreement that lowers the tariffs and promotes our global trading. And the reason is that Arkansas, we lead the nation in so many categories that are dependent upon the export markets, agriculture being a leading part of that. But just today, I talked to a businessman that he brought it up and said the tariffs are hurting him because they have to, part of their supply chain is in the steel industry. And the tariffs have jacked the prices up. It's costing them more money. It'll be passed on to the consumer if they can do that. And so there's a consequence to it. So I urge an end to this. Obviously, we want to have fair trade out there, but the end result needs to be lower tariffs and not higher tariffs.
Well, he seems prepared, sir, to jack it up some more. He's proposing as much, I think, as $350 billion more.
Well,
or tariffs on another $350 billion worth of Chinese imports.
Yes, and the Chinese are threatening retaliatory tariff, said they will have retaliatory tariffs in response to that. And so the question is, sure, I understand this brinksmanship, and I understand the need for a tough bargaining position as you go into the final negotiations. So I'm more interested in what is the end goal. And I think there's, and I hope the president reaches an agreement in which the tariffs can be lowered. That is my end goal. And Canada and Mexico is a good example of this, big trading partners for Arkansas. And right now there's a debate as they look at ratifying the NAFTA II agreement that we want to make sure it's agreed to, but that the tariffs are lowered. And I think that's a debate that continues between Congress and the administration.
Have you communicated, sir, recently with the administration, anyone with the administration, your concerns?
In a number of ways. It's been a while since I talked to the president on this, but I have talked to him personally about the concerns of Arkansas, particularly in the agricultural community, about tariffs. I've also communicated with Ambassador Lighthizer, with our Secretary of Agriculture, who's a good advocate for us, And we've also communicated by letters to our trading partners as to the harm that high tariffs would be in import tariffs on industries that impact our state. So we've communicated rather frequently on this topic. They know the message there, and we'll hope that we'll be able to resolve this.
Along the lines of economic development, sir, a viewer would like to ask are you prepared tonight to announce any new, you had the delight, I guess any governor would, of announcing some pretty large projects recently, a spate of them. You have anything else up your sleeve?
Well, we're always working on those, and I've got a director of economic development that's doing a great job, Mike Preston, but we're real thrilled with CZ USA, 600 jobs over the next 6 years that will be in central Arkansas. But what's exciting to me when you bring a company like that in, or whether Aerojet Rocketdyne down in Camden expands, that in our smaller communities, they will all benefit from the supply chain. And so while that big industry might not be located in the community, if you have a supplier, if you're going to be supplying parts and other items for the larger industry, that helps so many different communities in Arkansas. So it is a boost to our economic investment in Arkansas and our growth. We've got a very low unemployment rate, and it's a little bit challenging whenever you try to recruit a new industry with 600 employees and they say, where are we going to get those workers? And so that's why we want to move more people into the workforce, to make sure that we train them right. And so far, the companies understand that we do a good job of matching our workers with those companies that come in.
A viewer with a question, sir, about probably the most polarizing social issue on anybody's agenda, and that's abortion. A number of bills introduced, and you signed, I think, some this past session to limit abortion, or that would be the net effect. All of them pale against the bill signed just yesterday, I think, by your counterpart in Alabama, who makes no bones about it. All sides there acknowledge that this is an effort to force Roe back before the court. The minority leader in the House says it went too far. No exception for rape, no exception for incest. Do you agree? I heard
Congressman McCarthy's, majority leader's comment, and I think it was well stated, because I've always indicated that and supported prohibitions on abortion, but recognizing the need for exceptions for the life of the mother, rape, and incest. And in fact, the legislation that we passed this year that was, I think, handled well and is a better approach to it, which is if the Supreme Court reverses Roe versus Wade, then that would trigger a stricter prohibition in Arkansas, but it does recognize those exceptions of rape and incest. So I think our legislation is very pro-life, but at the same time, it's, I think, where more of America is in terms of recognizing those exceptions. And in terms of the challenge from other states, so that they hope a very severe prohibition will go up to the U.S. Supreme Court, I think it's important to challenge and create the pro-life environment by giving the court, the Supreme Court, chances to reverse Roe versus Wade or to roll it back, but they have to be supported by medical science. They have to be supported by thoughtful legislation, and I think we've done that here in Arkansas, and it's pushing the envelope, but I think we've got a good balance is what we've done so far.
Another issue, sir, and that's U.S. Supreme Court cleared the way for internet sales tax collection. What are your DF&A or your own personal best estimates of how much money we can expect, the state can expect from online sales taxes?
My recollection is that the estimates were about $35 million a year. And people say, well, that sounds low. And you've got to remember that we have Walmart that sells online. They've been paying online sales taxes because they're physically located here in Arkansas. You've got other suppliers here that sell. So we're all, and Amazon started voluntarily submitting that last year. And so I think the growth you have to be careful about and not to overestimate it. So I think DF&A took a conservative approach, $35 million, but that will be helpful. But the biggest benefit to our local consumers, our downtown businesses, is that it's a fairness issue, and that our brick and mortar businesses in downtown Arkansas will be better able to compete and survive and sell their products on an equal playing field.
Another viewer, sir, from Faulkner County, and this goes on the teacher pay issue. How is this going to be implemented? When can teachers begin to see their raise?
It goes into effect by this fall, so the next school year. And the $4,000 increase in teacher pay is an increase in the minimum teacher salary for our teachers coming out of school or they're entering the teaching profession. Now, so these are minimum salaries that we're increasing, and it goes up, I think it's $1,000 a year, round numbers, over the next 4 years for that $4,000 increase. So they'll start seeing it. Now, if you're an experienced teacher, you're not impacted by the minimum salary, except for the fact that that will obviously drive up the teachers' salaries, where you'll have to be competitive in the school districts with those more senior teachers as well. One thing we did that was unusual is that there was a concern about some of our rural school districts that might not have the wealth index as other schools, and they might have a challenge meeting that minimum salary requirement. So we set aside $60 million that they can apply for and help in meeting those new salary requirements. And so that was unique, but it was the right thing to do to make sure that all of our schools have the help that they need and can meet this new legal requirement.
The smaller counties, particularly rural counties in the Delta and the north central part of the state in South Arkansas, continue to lose population. It's going to be, it would seem, more and more expensive, more and more difficult to deliver to those areas public services, including education, at a level the Constitution, state Constitution, specifies. Do you see a long-range plan for that taking shape, sir?
I'm just thinking about the question, first of all, and you're right, there's some areas of Arkansas.
Just fewer kids out there. Yeah.
Sure. Some of the school districts are declining population that impacts them. We did redo the wealth index this year. That will help some of those school districts with declining populations to have a better investment from the state, and so we have made some adjustments along that line. We recognize the responsibility to make sure that every student, wherever they're going to school, has a quality education. That's part of what we did with our coding initiative, computer science. That's in every school. Some of them are online offerings, not computer science. We got the teachers in most of those classes. But we'll have to continue to look at some of the supplemental courses through online technology, and students are used to learning in that fashion, but you always have to have a teacher in the classroom to facilitate, to help them to learn. The other thing that is important is to continue trying to grow and to reverse the trend of declining populations in the rural areas of our state. And you know, I go down to some of the cities in southwest Arkansas, and they've got some factories that are booming down there, and they got people driving in from Texarkana and different places. And so I'm a little bit more optimistic about growth potential in Arkansas. There's some areas that are really sluggish. We want to be able to help that, diversify the economy, but we want to minimize the challenge it is on education, though.
In education, so our Clark County viewer writes into or calls in to voice concern about the comparative, according to the viewer, shortage of African-American teachers in Arkansas, that fewer and fewer, in his view, or her view, as it may be, African-American, bright African-American college students are choosing K-12 education as a career. Is there anything he, she asks that the state can do to encourage that?
Well, we actually are doing all that we can. I shouldn't say all that we can. We're doing more to encourage teachers to go into the profession. And this obviously should be a very diverse group that goes into the teaching profession. This year we actually did, you have football signing day for their careers. We had a teacher signing day this year. They recognize the importance of teachers as they graduate and that they're going into the teaching profession. There are some incentives out there for if they will go into a rural area or a school that has a hard time recruiting quality teachers. There are some state incentives for that purpose. In terms of African American teacher population, I don't know what the challenge is there, but we want to make sure that the teaching profession is open to everyone and that we certainly need minorities that are there teaching as well.
All right, 1-800-662-2386 for your phone-in questions, paffairs@aetn.org, and Twitter @AETN, #ARAsk. A viewer writes in to note, sir, that legal, at the state level anyway, medical marijuana is now legal. Your first impressions after, what, 5-6 days now of sales?
We have 2 retail distributorships in Hot Springs that's open. It's been a pretty robust market for them at this point. Obviously, people in Northeast, Northwest Arkansas and other parts are wondering, well, when are we going to have our retail stores open? And there's 30 that are in various process of opening, and I think they'll be gradually opening across the state over the next few days, next few weeks. I was looking at the demand, which actually surprised me, but I think there's about 300 new applicants for medical marijuana cards every week. And so that struck me as a fairly significant number that's growing. And so we're going to continue to monitor that just to see what that demand is. And I know the Marijuana Commission will, because they got to determine whether we have enough cultivation centers, the supply, and distribution centers as well. The key thing I always emphasize is this is medical marijuana and it's not recreational use marijuana. That's why it's strictly regulated. That's why we have licenses for transporters, for the cultivation centers, as well as the retail shops. And we have a good system in place to make sure that this is going to those that have legitimate medical needs. We'll see if there's challenges that develop on that line, but it is important to draw that distinction.
It would, I think, sir, surprise very few people if there were not another citizen initiative to legalize recreational marijuana, as a few states have done, particularly in Colorado. Your thoughts on that?
Well, it's probably not a surprise that I would oppose that.
No,
and, for a number of reasons. First of all, we have this new challenge with medical marijuana, and it's meeting needs of patients there. But let's get this right. I think you continue to look at what's happening in other states that have gone further with recreational use, and some of the reports I get are not good. But that's a decision that the people ultimately make, and it's still very complicating whenever you have federal law different than state law. And so I like where we are right now, that it's restricted to medical purposes. I think that's where the Arkansas public is, but we'll see if there's another drive that pushes it further. But I would be opposing that. I don't think that's right for Arkansas now.
A Facebook or viewer communicates via Facebook, noting that school shootings are still with us, and ask for your thoughts. Prevention.
It's a terrible thought, but it's the reality of where we are today in our society, that we have to make sure our schools are safe, and that means prevention, it means training, it means armed officers there in the school. And I'm so grateful for the work of the School Safety Commission that I appointed last year, that gave a very comprehensive report that The school districts responded very well and enhanced the security of their schools, did more security reviews, put more personnel in place to make sure that the students have the protection they need. But one other thing that we did that was important is recognizing that there's a mental health component to it, and that our school counselors that play a critical role in assessing students that might be a challenge or students that need mental health counseling, identifying and responding to that. And so our school counselors were spending too much time grading tests, doing administrative work rather than direct counseling with the students. We changed that law to require our school counselors to be more engaged in direct counseling, and for every school to have a comprehensive counseling program and assessment done. And so I think we've made some progress on a number of areas, but this is one that is a challenge every day in every school district, in every place in America. And we hope that it never happens in our schools, but you know, we're the law enforcement and with our school personnel, they're taking it very seriously and doing everything that they can to protect those students.
You had a previous relationship, sir, before taking office with the National Rifle Association, NRA, and there has been much written in the last 2-3 weeks about the internal disputes within the organization. Could I ask your thoughts on that?
Well,
has the leadership been in place too long, the NRA?
I don't know enough about their internal disputes, so I'm going to leave that to them to work out. But in terms of the NRA today, they did a good public service with their school safety initiative that invested a lot of money in bringing in law enforcement experts, Secret Service, and others to help us to know what better security systems we have in the schools. That's the initiative that I led, and I think that initiative is still going, but and it benefited some of the schools here in Arkansas.
Some observers detect a bit, rather a bit less reluctance on the part of some in public office to touch that third rail, which is gun control. Do you see much change in the political climate?
Well,
in terms of firearms regulation?
Not in terms of firearms regulation in Arkansas. We are a very pro-firearm state, pro-Second Amendment, and that's one of the reasons CZUSA felt comfortable coming here as a firearms manufacturer. But in terms of you know, lobbying effort, I mean, this last session, you know, the NRA supported some legislation that was passed. There was other legislation that they were not successful in getting through. So, you know, there's a reflection of independence. I mean, here again, you've got our representatives that are responding to their constituents and not to an outside organization. And I think that's a good thing. But we're very pro-Second Amendment and not for the regulations of firearms.
Well, this is sort of a Second Amendment question that comes from a viewer in Washington County. Do you think it's appropriate for police to auction off firearms that are confiscated or assigned to them by the courts?
Well, it's also what do they do with their discarded firearms? I mean, if they're going to replace old firearms with new firearms, what do you do with the old firearms? And so I think that's an open question, and I think that you ought to get some cost benefit for it. You know, it's one thing if you don't want to put back on the market a stolen firearm that's got the serial numbers edged out, but you know, if it's a legitimate firearm that you know, they're finished use of and they want to recover some of the cost on, I think that can be done on a case-by-case basis.
But in terms of confiscated through legal action, sir, in the courts, say ATF, I know, used to chop them up.
I don't know that there should be a blanket rule against it. I think I'll put it this way, I think you have to be very careful about it, because firearms are designed to be traceable as to their points of sale, and it's a little bit more difficult whenever you're confiscating it off of a felon that's committed another crime. So I think you have to be careful about it, but I don't know if I'd support any blanket rule right now.
Viewer notes, sir, that we're going to be voting come November on a proposal that would make citizen initiatives ballot access more difficult. Your thoughts?
Well, I signed the legislation. Well, actually, no, was this a ballot initiative that you're speaking of?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I didn't sign that.
Right.
That went straight to the voters, and I want to continue to look at that. I think it's fine to make it a rigorous test because you're amending the Constitution, and I think it has been very easy. I think it's both fair to make it more difficult for the General Assembly to refer about amendments, but it's also fair to make it a little bit higher hurdle for amendments to constantly be presented every year. You want to have the citizens the right to access the ballot, to have initiative measures, but amending the Constitution should be something that we are sure is not just controlled by outside groups, but that is something that's really initiated by the citizens. So I want to look at that more carefully before I take a final position on that.
Another viewer wants to know, sir, about another matter in the news. To what should felons be allowed to vote? Or how should felons be re-enrolled? Should they?
Well, I don't believe any felon that's sitting in prison should vote. I think if you're incarcerated, you should not have the right to vote. Now, if you finish paying your penalty, I think you ought to have the right to get a job, and you ought to have the right to vote restored. But it's a process that should happen after you complete your obligations and your penalty. And once you get off of parole, then you ought to have your vote restored.
Pulaski County viewer, sir, this comes up every so often. Why not daylight savings time here all year round?
You know, I just got accustomed to what we have. So I hope we don't have every state having a different rule on that, although they have the prerogative now. But I like some consistency in our approach to daylight savings, and I'm very accustomed to the adjustments every spring and fall, so I'm good with it. You know, so I'm sure the debate will continue, but I'm pretty fine with where we are right now.
Another viewer wants to know, we were talking about economic development and new plant openings, new factory announcements. Almost all of them have incentives at one or another level. Some local, state, are we paying too much?
No, we're winning, and this is a good job creation for us, and we're very careful about it. And it's very important to understand that, you know, our incentives that we put out there many times are for to equalize an infrastructure. They might need a rail line, you know, that gets closer to the plant, or they might need to have the land leveled, that if they went somewhere else they don't have to worry about that. So it puts us in a competitive position. And then we have some statutory credits for their job creation. And so if they're coming in and they don't create new jobs and drive our economy forward that the state's going to get a return on, then they don't get the benefit of those incentives. So we're very careful about it. And but it's absolutely necessary for us to compete for these jobs. And it's not just for jobs coming in from a Sig Sauer or for a CZ USA, but it's also for the expansion of our existing industry. Aerojet Rocketdyne down in Camden it moved many jobs from California to Arkansas as an expansion. And so this was an existing business expansion, and the incentives and the job creation benefits apply to them as well.
Another viewer, sir, wants to know if the state, in terms of economic development, what should the state be doing to promote environmentally friendly or carbon neutral, I'll extrapolate, carbon neutral industries in Arkansas, and what policies can the state enact, should it enact, to encourage a shift away from carbon?
Well, we are doing more in terms of alternative energy sources. The legislature passed legislation that makes it easier for solar, for net metering, which allows more to be able to generate solar energy and put it back on the grid. And so solar is something that we're really moving toward here in Arkansas, and that it fits well with our state. I also think our utility companies have, without overly aggressive and burdensome federal mandates. They have actually moved toward a good energy mix that includes alternative energy sources, as well as some of it's going from coal to gas, but we also have a good energy mix with hydro and with nuclear. These are energy sources that I support that have a low carbon footprint. Finally, it's sort of interesting, some of the industry that we recruit. L'Oreal is a great French company here in central Arkansas, and you go out there and they're committed under European Commission rules to move to alternative energy sources. And so some of the European investments help push us that direction as well. So I think industry is naturally moving toward alternative energy sources, sustainability, and we got some great leaders in that industry that's global examples of sustainability and trying to protect the environment.
The question, sir, from viewer notes that state got its report card, K-12, more or less issued one. Your takeaways?
Well, it's never as good as I'd like, but we've made progress. And so that's what I look at is student progression. I think our reading under our new initiative, the Science of Reading in third grade, has improved reading performance. But the schools accept that report card. It is transparent for the public. A school might get a C, a school might get a D, a school might get a B, and they know they've got to make progress. I was able to go to Spradling Elementary School in Fort Smith, and I went there because they went from a grade D to a grade B. Those are those students that did that, and it was the teachers there, and it was exciting just to showcase them and the progress that they made.
The charters continue, charter schools, and the debate certainly rages between charter versus public. Is that the right perspective on it, charter versus public?
Well, that's the first choice option. I mean, when you talk about choice in education, the first one is to make sure that a student is not locked in a failing public school and that they have a choice under our choice rules in Arkansas to go to an adjoining district or another school that they can perform better. So that choice within the public school environment is important. Charter schools is a part of that public school environment, and whether you love them or don't, it's a part of the environment that we have in education all across this country. And it gives parents a choice. They've been very successful in many areas. And what I like is the accountability that's required. You have our Department of Education that will revoke the charter of a charter school because they're not performing and meeting to their obligation. And they look at them very closely and hold them to standards of performance. I think it's requiring all of our schools to be competitive and to hold themselves accountable, and I think when you look at the students, that's a good thing.
Well, the charter opponents will say there's a lack of accountability in the charters, and your take?
Well, I don't think that's right. I mean, I read the newspaper and I see what our charter reviewing Department of Education is doing, and I've seen charters revoked and I've seen charters denied, and they're looking at it very carefully, and I applaud them for it. So, and obviously the design of a charter is that they have more flexibility. Well, under a law that was passed, if a charter in a district has flexibility, then the traditional school also has flexibility from the rules. And so, and everything we're doing is trying to make it a competitive environment between our public schools so that parents have choices, and that schools that perform well are going to have students attracted to them. And if you're not performing well, then the students shouldn't be trapped there. They should have an option.
What constitutes a failing school, other than the grade? What makes a school fail, sir?
Well, first of all, you could have physical distress, in which probably has been the vast majority of takeovers. They get in financial trouble. Then secondly, you have year after year of a failing school that's not meeting the academic performance for the students. And you know, there's the measurements that we have statewide that we can measure the performance and the progress.
Well, is it a reflection of student body? Is it a reflection of ethnic, socioeconomic caste, class in a particular that dominates perhaps a particular school?
Well, you have special challenges for schools that have a high percentage of low income or supported lunch programs in the school, and you know, they have some particular challenge, maybe not the parental support that you have in some other homes, but what you measure is progress, and you also have to assume that these students want to learn, they have the capacity to learn, and so where's the deficiency? Is it we need to provide more support, more rigorous individual tutoring in terms of reading, which is part of our RISE initiative and our reading program. So yes, there's schools that have more challenges than others, and that's one of the things that we're focusing on in education is what additional support do we need to give them. And that's where the money flows, and that's part of the necessity of providing a quality education for all students.
A viewer, sir, asked about your views on the term limits proposal.
Well, the term limits proposal was referred by the General Assembly back to a vote of the people.
Yes, sir.
That, you know, it's never the way I want it drafted. I would have done it differently. But we did have a very austere term limits that then was adjusted to where it was too far widely, you know, that they allow too much service. This, I think, has a middle ground there, and we'll see what the voters respond to it. But they'll have another chance on whether they want to further restrict term limits for our elected officials. I'm under term limits. I get 2 4-year terms, and so this is debate about term limits within the legislative branch. We have term limits. I think the question is, what is the right number of years that they serve?
Do you want to say yet whether you going to vote for it?
Not yet.
Another matter that came up a second ago, and that was special session. Do you anticipate at this point, you see anything on the horizon that might cause you to summon them?
Not at this point. You know, we just finished our session, and you know, historically we wind up having a special session during the interim. But at this point, we got a lot of work to do, and I don't see a necessity for having a special session.
Well, along those lines, is a fiscal session necessary? Should we go back to biennial?
I don't believe a fiscal session is necessary. You know, it's interesting that in Congress, the big reform item that they talk about in Congress is to get away from annual budget sessions and go to a biennium budget. That's the reform in Washington, and here in Arkansas we went the opposite direction. We had a good biennium budget. We went to annual fiscal sessions, and no, I don't think that's necessary, and we'll see if that's changed down the road. Well,
they can't. Let me go back to your congressional days, if I can, sir. It's been some decades, actually, since you were in D.C., well, at least sitting in the Congress. What do you make sure of the climate now?
Not healthy. Every side is divergent in their views. It's hard to get them to come together, to reach compromise. And you know, even the most logical of bills that ought to be passed in terms of getting bipartisan support, like an infrastructure bill, I hope it happens, but I'm not confident that it will happen this year. And so there's challenges there. We got great delegation from Arkansas, but in terms of getting things done, it's very difficult with a divided Congress and Senate and administration. The American people gave us a divided Congress, and that slows things down.
It would be very difficult fiscally, too. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars that both the Democratic leadership and the White House have agreed to. and no real idea on how to fund it.
Whenever you look at, the president tries to reach a deal on infrastructure in the trillions of dollars, and Congress is more like $200 billion. The question is, how do you pay for it? Let's make sure we're careful. The way we're positioning ourselves in Arkansas on infrastructure, we can have anything that they could do in Washington will be a benefit to us. We're going to have the funds to leverage against larger dollars in Washington to get some of these major projects done if they devote even $200 billion across the country. So I'm for an infrastructure bill, but I do think they have to be careful. I'm concerned about the national debt, deficit spending. You mentioned that it's been a long time since I was in Congress, but what was that, I left in 2001. I left in 2001, and that was the last year we had a balanced budget in our country. And so that was, 18 years ago.
Right. Governor, thank you for your time, because we're out of it here.
Thank you. Enjoy
Governor,
the
thank you
conversation.
very much again. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Arkansans Ask Governor Asa Hutchinson is underwritten by the Arkansas State Employees Association, Incorporated, an organization of state employees working toward the betterment of state government.